Hi, my name is Lex Williford, and here is a short overview of the prose poem and the short story. Part 1, an overview. Since the short story and the prose poem may often have essentially the same word count, usually 1,000 words or fewer, the first question people ask me when I begin to describe the two forms is, are they the same thing? Yes and no. How much do the two forms overlap? It depends. I'd like to think that it's possible to write a prose poem that's also a short story and vice versa. That's the ideal anyway, and we'll get to that in a bit. But all this can get a bit complicated. So, let me first start by trying to describe the short story as I see it, then the prose poem. At the end of this course, I hope you'll know enough about both forms to disagree with me, or at least to help me refine my descriptions. I won't be the first person to have trouble distinguishing between the two forms, but I think I have an idea which is which and how they're different. So let me tell you what I think. First, a few words about the short and its history. We'll be reading more extensive histories of this form and that of the prose poem in our assigned books, but here's a short overview. One could easily argue that the short form itself has been with us at least as long as the written word, and probably much longer. Taking the form of fables, parables, and short tales, it has evolved in the modern and contemporary eras into such diverse forms as jokes or 30 to 60-second television commercials, which advertisers pay networks millions of dollars to show during the Super Bowl. In a sense, the more modern life has sped up, one could argue, the shorter our attention spans and our stories have become. But in the able hands of such writers as Hemingway, Isaac Dennison, and Isaac Babel, Raymond Carver, Lydia Davis, and Mark Boodman, a writer who's recently written a novel and short stories, one could argue that the best examples of the form have reached the pinnacle of literary craft, especially shorts being written right now, today. In addition to his famous story, A Very Short Story, from our time, Ernest Hemingway himself is credited with one of the shortest stories ever, For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn. The entire story is there, only the tip of the iceberg showing as Hemingway would have it, the larger story and all its implications hidden beneath the surface, the death of a child, the grief of the child's parents, and so on. Honduran-born Augusto Monterroso is often credited with writing the shortest story in the world, El dinosaurio. Cuando despertó, el dinosaurio todavía estaba allí. Variably translated into, upon waking, the dinosaur was still there, or when she or he awoke, the dinosaur was still there. The story is known for its ambiguity, especially that vague pronoun reference. Who awoke, we ask, a person or the dinosaur itself? The ambiguity can keep one interpreting the story in all its possible permutations for hours. The short stories were popular in such jazz-era magazines as Collier's, Scribner's Magazine, and the Saturday Evening Post. The form really didn't come into its own until the late 70s and early 80s, popularized by such writers as the minimalist Raymond Carver and the fantasist Donald Barthelme. Since then, a short 20 to 30 years later, the form has exploded into so many varying types that it's hard to keep up with them all. The names people have struggled with and suggested to define them continue to change, but a few names have stuck, at least for now. Nanofiction may refer to fiction under 100 words, and may include such forms as the 55 fiction, 55 words or fewer, the 69er, exactly 69 words long, and the drabble, exactly 100 words. Microfiction may also refer to stories this long, though some argue that these very short stories come in at 400 words or fewer. Flash fiction, sometimes referred to as quick fiction or mini-fiction, usually runs about 500 words, and sudden fiction 750 words or fewer. These definitions are, of course, fluid, and because they focus primarily on word count, the quantity of words in the stories themselves, they're not a reliable way of defining the short form, especially in terms of quality. Even so, such terms are a useful place to start. While it's true that the short story might contain the lyrical language and metaphorical development of prose poems, Short shorts tend to be linear and to have a dramatic development. That is, these stories use standard narrative techniques such as very brief passages of exposition and a more or less chronological development, scene by scene. But the turns or reversals in these stories are mostly dramatic, reversals in character and or reader expectation, not just a change to a different state, but to an opposite state. The short short then tends to be prosaic rather than lyrical, logical and chronological, with causal connections, one event causing the next, and so on. They also tend to have a more traditional development, rational in the sense that one thing follows logically, if not also chronologically, to the next. I'd argue that such stories, while they may have begun in a kind of right brain inspiration, ultimately appeal to a left brain understanding of causality and character. And for this reason, such stories tend toward the realistic, with a development that relies heavily upon authenticity of character, verisimilitude of detail, and a certain stubborn believability, even when a story turns towards shock and surprise. The best of these short shorts, like any powerful story, are both surprising and inevitable. We've all experienced such stories. When, for example, was the last time you experienced betrayal by someone you love? When it happens, you're shocked. But over time, as you look back to the events of a relationship, you see clues that you may have not seen before or wanted to see before. And you say, of course, that's exactly what that person would have done, but only in retrospect. The writer must rebuild the story from recollection and imagination, and chooses to do so in a more or less chronological, linear development, to reproduce the experience of a particular idea or emotion for the reader. Because one may read such stories in a short sitting, on a subway car, in a coffee house, they become quite popular in recent years. Magazines such as the North American Review, the oldest literary magazine in the U.S., has an anthology of its former editor, Rob Lee Wilson's 4-minute fictions, for example. And Quarterly West still regularly publishes short shorts as it has since the 1980s. And new magazines have arisen. Diane Williams' Noon, Mark Boudman's Vestal Review, Smoke Long Quarterly, Brevity, Quick Fiction, Night Train's Firebox Fictions, and so on. An annual short contests from such magazines as the Southeast Review's famous World's Greatest Short Story Contest, with its award of $100 and a crate of Florida oranges, have proliferated. And with new mobile technologies, these short shorts are showing up more often on people's mobile phones, Kindles, and iPads. Recently, for example, former Esquire editor Tom Jenks' Narrative magazine has begun to sponsor its new iStory contest, launching its own iPhone app. Clearly, the form is alive and thriving, and it offers many unpublished writers a first shot at publication. When discussing the differences between the short short and the prose poem, one could simply say that fiction writers write the former, while poets write the latter. While this simple distinction is certainly true in my experience, poets I know mostly write what they call prose poems, and fiction writers mostly write what they call short shorts. I still think the distinction is far too simplistic because the two forms often actually overlap and reinforce a kind of genre bending and blending. Even so, the prose poem is, for me, just as distinctive as the short form, yet considerably different in its means of development.